What's going on, creatives? I'm Dustin Valkema, and in today's video we're going over my process on selecting hair easily using channels inside of Photoshop. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Alright guys, so here we are in Photoshop, and in this image, this process actually works quite well. You can see that my model's on a gray backdrop, which currently looks a little bit more blue, and that's primarily just because of the white balance. The key right on the left side, or camera left, is lightening our hair up on that side, which creates a nice separation, and then the rim light on the opposing side, on the right side of the image, is creating a really nice contrast between the golden gel that was there and then backlighting the hair from the backdrop. So this kind of naturally creates a separation. And so most of the time when I'm shooting, this is what I'm going for, especially when I know that it's going to be a composite. So the way that I do this is actually all in the channels panel. And I use different RGB channels, sometimes multiple, but in this case I can see that the red channel is going to work best for this. I'll use these as a very good base to start from, and then I'll continue dodging and burning the background or the foreground depending on which one needs it to make sure that I can get that selection. So what we'll do just to work non-destructively here is duplicate. So Command or Control J will duplicate that layer and head back into the channels. If you can take a look at the red, green, and blue channels, you can see that the red channel has the best contrast pop from the hair to the background. So to start off here with the masking process, I'm just going to right click on this red channel and go to Duplicate Channel, click OK, and that will create an alpha channel here that I can work from. We'll just rename that alpha. And that'll give us a good base to start from. So using the burn tool, I typically like to keep my range on shadows. Most of the time I shoot on a charcoal gray backdrop, so I know that the background will be the darkest part and easiest to separate from the hair. And so we'll use the shadows, and then exposure will be around 32%. We don't want to go too high to where we're burning everything, but not too low that it takes forever. This process is typically based around building a composite from later, and so I know that I can always go back and adjust things later on once we create our layer mask. When I start burning, I make sure that I stay away from the inner sides of the model's head, and I just focus on the areas around, like the flyaways and things like that, that I just need to be cut out but aren't completely transparent, whether there's a depth of field or just these simple flyaways. You just want to stay away from anything inside of that. So I'll make sure that I keep everything as close to black as possible without making it too crunchy. So you get into this area here, and what I don't want to do is burn it all the way down like this. That creates a hard transition from light to dark because there is some detail there that can be saved. And when I work on an image this way, usually if it's a full body, I'll typically cut off the model's head after masking out the portions of the body that I know I want to keep, that are typically harder transitions like this here. I'll usually just cut the head off on a different layer and then work on that separately so I can make the selection. But in this case here, we're just going to work around, and we will say burn everything here on the edges and make this black. And then we can go back in and paint that in a little bit later after we create the layer mask in the process. So it doesn't need to be too crazy. You don't want to spend too much time on it depending on what you're building it for. In this case, it's a little bit more of a composite image, and so I'm not overly concerned. I'll show you guys hopefully here at the end of this video how to take care of some of the fringing that might happen. But right now we're just focused on getting the primary parts of the hair selected. This can get a little bit complicated at times depending on what your background looks like. But right now it's not. This should just give you guys the base of how I do it, because every image is different and you guys might run into a little bit different scenario. So this should be a good introduction to the rough process. So When I hit areas like this that I know are going to be black, I'll typically just grab my lasso tool and I'll create what's called a garbage mask, which is just a very loose selection. And I can select that entire area here and just press delete with my background color at black. And that will just turn all of that black. So I'll just go ahead and do that around the rest of the image here. I'll press Control or Command D to deselect that area. And then you can see here that now almost everything in the background is already black. So what we need to do next is actually grab the dodge tool, and you can just press Shift O because we're currently on burn. If you press Shift O, it'll just cycle through everything in that panel there. And so we'll select the dodge tool. I like to keep it on highlights because what we really want to work on is everything that's just inside this mask now. And so we will just burn everything here. Again, staying away from everything on the outer edge to try to keep a somewhat soft transition. And this can be a little bit harder on the exposure right now, and then as we work our way out, we can tone that down just a little bit more. So we'll just keep dodging around the edges here. Everything that's white is going to be completely opaque. And so that's why we don't want to get as close to the outside flyaways and things like that that we want to keep in the scene. Now this process might not work on every single image that you do. I feel that it's really good to kind of know maybe 4 or 5, 10 different workarounds for everything that you may need to go through in Photoshop. And what that's for is basically just like a troubleshooting scenario. Like if you guys run into anything that needs, say, a little bit more of this process or less of this process, if you need to do more of like a hue-based range selection or anything like that, your process on doing so can adjust per image. So it's really good to know a few different ways to go about it. So at this point, I've gone around all of the edges, and you can see here that I have a few points that, like this one here, that create these hard transitions. And so what I'll do next is I'll just grab a brush tool again with a solid white. We'll make that a hard brush, and then you do want to make sure that your pen sensitivity is off, because if your pen sensitivity is on, it can be really easy to not have 100% pure white, which will make part of your subject transparent. But we'll just go and create a very loose paint over here on the inside of our model so that we can see exactly the areas that we need to take care of next. Because we know that we want to keep the model, so everything here is just going to be a solid white. Now that we've got the inside of our model taken care of, the next step is to make this a little bit more of a soft transition from light to dark on the outer edges here. And so I'll press Shift O again to get back to our dodge tool. You can press O or Shift O depending on whatever you're at. You want to make sure you're back on your dodge tool. And I will make sure that my range at this point is set to midtones, because now we're not really dealing so much with the whites or the pure blacks in the image, and we want to just affect those gray areas that are in between. I'll set my exposure probably up a little bit higher just so that we can work faster here. And you just make sure that this transition as you're painting in just kind of feathers nicely from from your midtones to your highlights. So you just kind of work your way around. Just make sure that a lot of that's taken care of. Towards the end of this, we might end up having to go back into our highlight dodge to make sure that we can pull out a few more of the hair chunks that are kind of sitting out and they're just right on the edges there. It's not really too bad to have to go back and forth. Sometimes you have to do it, sometimes you don't. I typically like to do this fairly quickly because it can take a long time for one, and for two, it's really important to kind of get on and move along with your composites. Depending on what your timelines look like. If you're doing client work, sometimes you need to work faster. Sometimes you can use different methods to cheat a process or work a little bit faster. So this here will just make sure that everything else that we want gets as close to white as possible. All right, so that should actually look pretty good. I think I'll take these here a little bit more. So with bigger chunks of hair like this here on the left side, I might just head right back into my highlights so that I can dodge those highlights just a little bit more and pull a little bit more of an opacity to that. And see if there's anywhere else that I might need to work around just slightly. At this point, you can see that we have a pretty good mask now to where the hair is primarily white and the background is black. And you can see that it gets fairly muddy in this area here where a lot of those flyaway hairs are just kind of clumping. We had a fan blowing on her in this shoot, and that caused a whole lot of flyaways. I will take my burn tool again, and I will just hit some of these shadows here on this edge just to pull those a little bit darker. Throughout the compositing process, this isn't always perfect, and so there's plenty of times like this here where I may just cut that hair out altogether and then paint it back in with a hairbrush. Now that we have our mask created, I will control click or command click the alpha channel here, just that thumbnail, and I'll head back into layers. So on this new layer here, I will just create a layer mask, and if I turn off the background layer, you can see now that the hair is all selected. There are parts of it that are better than others, but that's okay. So, not a layer mask. If we go in and create a solid color background, set that right around 50% gray. You can see here what's happening with certain areas to where this hair is actually masked out fairly well, but the color information and the alpha information aren't lining up perfectly. So what I'll typically do here is create a new layer and place that above my subject. And I can just use a clipping mask. If you hold Alt or Option down and then just hover in between the two layers there, you can click and create a clipping mask pretty easily. And I will select one of the brighter parts of her hair. If you hold down Option with the brush tool selected, you can just select whatever color works for you inside there. So now using the brush tool, I can just paint ever so slightly. Sometimes you may just want to change your opacity, which I have forgot that I took off my pen sensitivity. If you press any of the numbers on your keyboard, you can actually change the opacity of your brush to a numeric value and multiple, in between values if you press them quickly. So I will just sit at 30% here, and I will just start to paint on this layer, and you can see what's happening is that it's just creating the flyaway color based off of that layer mask that we had created previously. So this is actually how I take care of 90% of my fringing that happens here on the hair. And we can get to selecting the body out in a different video. This one here is just primarily based around the hair and creating these selections. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. You may need to reselect. You just want to select a higher color of whatever it is in that area. It's not always bad to paint a little bit over the hair just to make sure that there's a nice transition there. A lot of times I'll do this when I create my background or my matte painting, or just to go replace the background. I may select a color of the background to create the hair flyaways. It really depends on what the overall outcome is that I want to go for. And so this is really the process, guys. It's really not nearly as hard as it may look when I'm doing a speed edit. But I definitely understand where it can be a little bit intimidating when you go to dive into it right away. But it's a really fun process, and there's a lot of things you can do with this here. And in one of the later tutorials, I will do a full channel breakdown, just kind of how I use the channel palette to create select store masks that I have. I think that's something that would be really useful for you guys overall. So this is taking care of the fringing here. If I turn this layer on and off now of our paint over for the fringing on the outside, you can see exactly what's happening and how that's kind of fixing a lot of those issues that you normally get when you're masking anything with channels. Sometimes it can be hard to crunch values, which is fine. It's just a matter of finding a workaround to deal with it. So I see that these flyaways are actually creating some problems here that I think just look muddy to me personally. It's not something appealing that I would want to keep in my final composite. So I will just use the brush tool on this layer mask. And I don't want to do this with the layer mask visible because I do want to see what's happening in the overall image. And so I'll just select the layer mask, make sure that my brush tool is selected, and I will select black as my foreground color. And this is quite okay to do with a lower opacity. I'm not too concerned. I do want to make sure that anything that I need is feathered. And so I'll just begin to paint over these flyaways here on the outside, just right on that layer mask, and you can see how that's getting rid of them. So that's working pretty good. Not sure if there's any others. Maybe able to do this here on the outside. Maybe a little bit more in this area. Now there's parts of the image here that you can see right on the inside here where her hair was blowing and the background still showing through. I typically don't worry about those too much because once I get the color grading and matching my subject to the background, that may just bleed right into the background. You may not even notice that that area is there. It is kind of tricky. If we go back into our red channel here, you can see that that's a very muddy area and that there's no definite highlights or shadows because the separation there just didn't work too well. And it's really not a problem because you can always fix that later on in the post process once you get to compositing. Now that we've got the hair primarily taken care of as far as masking goes, I can take care of the shoulders here. You can see that they're still cut off by the layer mask. And this right side's actually fairly easy because we can see exactly where we need to paint. The left side is a little bit different because that was in shadow, and so we'll have to take care of that separately. And so I'll have the layer mask selected, and what I'll do is continue using the brush tool. I'll set my opacity to 100%, and I will take off my pen pressure sensitivity. And with a somewhat hard brush, typically what I like to do is make sure that the hardness or softness of my brush matches whatever the depth of field is creating there, or the softness of the outside. And so I'll typically just use this and I will trace right along the edges. Like I said earlier on in the process, a lot of times I will just go in and cut the head off my subject after creating an overall layer mask that'll select all the parts of a costume or the outer parts of your subject, anything other than the hair, because a lot of times you really want to treat the hair separately because it's the most difficult to do. And so I find it easier just to select everything first and then run back to the hair afterwards. So we'll take care of this left side here as well. And I'll actually use this same method. It can be dirty. This is just an overall tutorial. All right, so that part looks good. Now we have this part here on the left side of her head, camera left, that looks a little bit dull now because we took all of the flyaways out in that area. And so I'll just kind of show you guys my process on how I might fix that just a little bit. So I'll create a new layer, and then with my brush tool selected, I will select really one of the colors from this area in general, just like we did when we were fixing the fringing issues. And I will find a hairbrush. There's a lot of hairbrushes that you can find online. It really doesn't matter what you use. Maybe I'll show you guys how to create hairbrushes in a different tutorial here. But I will select that hairbrush, and you can just paint some of those extra flyaways that you may have been missing if your composite needs it. Sometimes you don't really need any extra, hair detail. Sometimes it may be nice. I'm not actually using this image here for a real composite, so I'm not really too worried about it at the moment. But you just make sure that you grab some of those hairs, the color of the hair, and you can just paint any of that hair information right back on. You can see here in this process how we took just a crazy studio shot and masked out the hair. So that will work pretty good with any composite that you really want to place this on. Your images might be a little bit different. The process might take a little bit longer. We did run through this faster than I may normally take, but I do find that any workflow to a quick, clean result is pretty good. And so the more you practice it, the faster you can go and move right along in your process. So that's it, guys. Just made it through my first tutorial. Thanks for that. So today we talked about creating complex selections using channels in Photoshop. This is really the process that I use 90% of the time, especially for studio shots. Sometimes when you're outdoors, it's a little bit more complex, but sometimes there are other workarounds that you can use. So I highly encourage everybody to just go and learn your own process and to take all of this stuff here from a conceptual level and not really focus so much on exactly the tools that I'm using. You may find your own process on doing so. So make sure to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell icon so as I upload more content, you guys are the first to see it. And just reach out. If you guys have anything that you're not finding on the web that I can possibly help with, I'm just here to make sure that you guys have the best value for my channel possible. Thanks for being here. See you later.